Hello, good evening and welcome to the first in a new era of the eFootball podcast. My name's Dan Tracey, and after my impressive debut on the eSpurs podcast last week, they've only gone and given me my own show. Yes, I don't believe it either. Joining me tonight, I've got Rob Tonkinson. He's an Arsenal fan, but don't hold that against him. And also, I've had to dip into the loan market and sign James McCarthy. Unfortunately for fans of Everton and Republic of Ireland, it's not the James McCarthy, but that's no less a quality of guest. So, firstly, good evening to you guys. Are you alright?
Yeah, mate, I'm absolutely fantastic. I don't know how I feel about sharing a podcast with an Arsenal fan, but I suppose I'll let you off as it's your first one.
Needs must. I was desperate. I'm only joking, Rob. How are you doing, Rob? You alright?
I'm alright, mate. I'm good, thanks.
Brilliant.
I've been ganged up on already. It's only been like 2 minutes.
To be fair, as it's not a Spurs podcast, we'll take our Spurs hats off as much as we can this week. There might be a bit of a North London rivalry, but I guess that's only natural. My first question, which is an important question, have you watched any football in the last sort of 7 days? Because if not, we are going to struggle to fill half an hour. So you need to sort of help me a bit here. Have you actually watched some football?
I have. I've watched most of the FA Cup, to be honest.
Brilliant.
That's all you need.
Well done for actually sort of watching most of the FA Cup, because a lot of people don't tend to sort of bother now with that competition. But that's something we can touch on later. As it's early in the week, we may as well go what's freshest in the memories, and that is Sutton versus Arsenal. I guess for Arsenal, it was almost kind of an impossible game where had they won, it's a game where they're expected to win anyway because it's Sutton, anything but a win, and it's absolute crisis at the Emirates, isn't it? So obviously they cleared that hurdle, but what did you think of it, James?
I mean, it pained me to sit through 90 minutes of watching Arsenal. I'm sorry, my Spurs tinted glasses are going to have to stay on for a little bit longer. I was cheering on for Sutton. They say that's what the FA Cup's all about, you know, a big team like Arsenal, I say big team in inverted commas, a big team like Arsenal going to somewhere like Sutton and putting on a show for them, you know. But I'd have loved another cup upset. I've enjoyed watching teams like Lincoln going far in the tournament. You can't beat a small team popping up against a big team and really making a shock. But wasn't to be last night, unfortunately. The only entertainment out of last night's game was probably watching an overweight man eat a pie on the bench.
Yes.
But, you know.
Yeah, you're right. Actually, Piegate has exploded. If we've got some time at the end, we'll gloss over that, because I mean that is just getting out of hand already. But Rob, a question for you: did you feel perhaps that the BBC was almost desperate for Sutton to win that game, just to sort of build on the whole romance of the cup and bring out every possible cliche? Was it getting a little bit almost sickening towards the end, just the sort of narrative of the game, or were you just sort of happy to sort of go along and almost be glad to be through to the quarterfinals?
I wouldn't say it was anything anti-Arsenal, to be honest. Had it been any of the Premier League clubs against Sutton on a Monday night, BBC would have trotted out the same lines about one of the romantic joke. When you're the big club in that situation, you sort of just have to live with it. And as frustrating as it gets to hear commentary so one-sided, it's Sutton's day in the sun, although it was a night game. Sutton's night under the moonlight in that respect.
Yeah, that'll do.
It was their 15 minutes, and for a club like them, that's going to do them brilliant. Bit of a shame that Arsenal weren't allowed to donate the entire revenue from the game to them, although we have given them 50 grand for a classroom for the training ground, which is quite a nice gesture from us. But yeah, I'm happy to get through, because I was so negative after the Bayern game. That, oh my god, this is setting up. If there's any big club in the top 6 that would fall to Sutton, who are fighting for their lives at the bottom of the conference, it would be Arsenal, especially after the week in crisis, after the disaster up in Munich, or down in Munich rather. So I'm just happy to get through, to be honest.
I guess
roll on Lincoln City.
Yeah, I guess the script was almost sort of written perfectly for Sutton, especially after the way that Arsenal were torn apart in Munich. It wrote its own story, but obviously Arsenal had other ideas in mind. And going back to you, Rob, the fact that Arsene Wenger made 7 changes, did you sort of feel that none of them really sort of kicked down the door in terms of earning a first team place at the weekend? Was it a case of going through the motions, or perhaps that Sutton did actually make a good account of themselves? What did you think of the team that was put out yesterday and how they performed?
I think if there's one player that I would like to see get a good run out in the first team, it's Lucas Perez, who I think there's been a few reports coming out that he wants to move, I presume back to Spain, but he wants to move away from Arsenal. And really that would be a shame, because in the limited appearances he's made this season, he has made an impact in every single one, either by scoring or getting an assist. And really, I feel bad for him in a way, because he's a player that should really be looked at for a first team shout. He got a few games over Christmas, and I don't know if he picked up another knock or not around then, but he just seemed to fall down the pecking order, perhaps because Giroud had also started a very decent goal scoring run at the time, and he was being rotated more than Perez. But out of everyone last night, Perez is someone that I think really needs to be given more of a look in the first 11. Other than that, Petr been a bit ropey in the last few games. Maybe David Ospina, who did play quite well in Munich, and I mean, he didn't have much to do last night, but other than almost gifting them a goal right before half time, didn't do anything wrong either, so perhaps that's another one. But no, it wasn't it was a shame. The last time we played a non-league team was Farnborough Town back in, I think, 2003, I want to say, and that was like a 5-0 or a 5-1, and nothing close last night. I don't know if it's just the way we play. It's so different now that we never seem to smash any team. I'm not entirely sure, but other than Southampton in the round previous, I don't, which isn't great when I want to give this point, but I don't really remember the last time you really do kill teams off like this. So Sutton played above themselves, definitely, but I feel that it's more to do with Arsenal don't blow teams away as much anymore.
I mean, it's the thing that I can relate it to the most is when Andros Townsend was getting a run out in the Spurs team against Europa League sides, and he was looking like this player who was ready to make a step up into the first team, and then when he got his chance in the Premier League, he completely disappeared. You know, you have to remember that these guys are playing against lesser opposition, and then when they make the step up into the Premier League, they go missing, they disappear, and that's something that managers have got to think through.
With you both being fans of North London clubs and me being a Spurs fan as well, I guess there are certain parallels between Lucas Perez and Vincent Janssen in the fact that they both need a run of Premier League games to be a better player, to be playing at the level that they should be at, because it's like you say, it's all very well rolling over teams that in Europa League or the FA Cup, etc. But unfortunately, teams certainly at that top of the table, in that sort of top six, they don't have the luxury of giving the likes of Perez, Janssen a run of games, because if they don't score, they're not going to win. And then, that's the difference perhaps between Champions League and Europa League. So it's very hard to sort of give players that time, and if they don't take their opportunities, I know Perez is probably taking his one better than Janssen's on the basis of last night, but again, Sutton versus a European team, is it comparable? So it's a difficult balancing act really, especially when these players they're brought in mind to be a backup player, so it's hard to sort of then say, right, you're going to be playing for the next 6 games, because like I say, if they don't hit the ground running, then they're almost at the back of the queue, so it's difficult. Where would you sort of sit on that, James?
No, I think you're completely right, and I mean, I think backup players has really been a theme of this year's FA Cup. I know it's something that you wanted to discuss, and I think it's really affecting the state of the competition as a whole. I mean, and I know that I can't stop mentioning Tottenham. I apologise for that in advance, but you see the Spurs went with a full strength side yesterday against Fulham, and it benefited them. It benefited the competition. It benefited everyone. Whereas you look at teams like, my example would be Leicester, got nothing to play for. They've made 6 changes and they've gone out of the competition. You've got nothing to play for domestically. I suppose you could argue that they're in a relegation battle. Teams like Huddersfield, mid-table in the Championship, and they're making 6 or 7 changes to play against Man City. And I think it really is killing the competition, this whole backup player debate. And Spurs, they never really broke stride against Fulham. They never needed to. It was like a training exercise, and they come off the back of that result with confidence, smiles on their faces, and ready for the next game.
Absolutely, and that does bring me actually nicely onto the next point. So well done, James. You've read my mind. But I wanted to expand on the wider FA Cup in the fact that you've hit the nail on the head about teams that are perhaps resting players when they might not need to, using the cup as the sort of bottom of their priorities. If we take, for example, Lincoln, obviously they're through to the quarterfinals, and it's taking nothing away from their giant killing result against Burnley. But, Rob, here's a question for you. Does the fact that Burnley have rested so many players, probably unneedlessly, with the fact that they're very comfortable in the league at the moment, does that slightly diminish Lincoln's win on Saturday?
There's not going to be an asterisk next to that when you look through the record books. It's still going to be Lincoln got to the last 8 of the FA Cup that year, and I understand what you're saying. Yes, they're resting players playing people that won't get games in the Premier League as many times, but they're still top-level players. They're still players that are playing for Burnley Football Club in the Premier League, compared to Lincoln, who are top of the conference, doing very well, look like they might get back into the Football League, but still none of those Lincoln players are going to get signed to be backups in the Premier League anytime soon. So, no, to me, it's great. I love watching shocks other than last night. So, to me, Lincoln getting through to the next round, it's not diminished in any way by Burnley resting so many players.
That's a fair point, well made. Sort of a good way to look at things, I expect. But if we sort of then say, why are teams, for example, like Bournemouth in the third round, why are they resting a whole 11? And obviously they're punished for it when they're, at the time, comfortably in the top half of the Premier League table. Does this point to the fact that the Premier League, for those 20 clubs, is literally the be-all and end-all? And you can almost now expand that to the Championship, where Brighton lost to Lincoln in the fourth round. They made changes because do they feel that a cup run on top of 46 and potentially even more games from the playoffs, is that too much of a season for them as well? Does the FA Cup need saving, or has the likes of Lincoln and Sutton once again sort of conjured up the, dare I say, romance again? What do we do with the FA Cup if we need to do anything? What do you reckon, James?
I think it really is in crisis. I think, you've got your shocks in your Lincoln and your Sutton and all that, but there were so many dour games, in these weeks gone past. That Man City Huddersfield game was terrible. There's been a number of games like that, where teams, as you say, Bournemouth being that perfect example, Leicester too, that they have nothing to play for in their domestic leagues, and so why not give the fans something to aim for? I know, a day out at Wembley, not in the Champions League, in the FA Cup is everything to a supporter. They're the kind of the days out that you dream of taking your friends and your family to. And I think clubs need to value that. They need to think that yes, the FA Cup might not be it might not be our top priority, but if Burnley aren't looking to entertain their fans, then what are they looking to do? Because then they can't be aiming for the Champions League, they can't be aiming for the Europa League. They're more or less safe from relegation thanks to their home form. And you've got to think, what are they hoping to get out of this season? It's something that Spurs fans, not just myself, have thought for years on end, that we'd swap some of our best nights in the Premier League and in Europe for a nice trophy at Wembley. It's a debate that rages on whether we should be prioritising Premier League games to get back into a European competition, which we're then going to ignore so that we can prioritise to get back into that European competition. And it's what I've always said about the Europa League, and it is what I will say about the FA Cup. And Spurs' second string side, I know for a fact, isn't as good as its first string. There's been times where our second string players really haven't been up to the task, and it's upsetting to see us crash out of competition that we'd love for us to carry on in. I'm from the vein of thought that I'd always love to see Spurs rumbling on in the Cup. I'd love an away day at Wembley that isn't for the Champions League, and I know plenty of fans of every club who are from the same vein of thought.
That's a great point, James. I think it's always that argument of, especially, I don't want to sort of use Arsenal as an example again and use it as a stick to beat them, but do you rather win trophies and have those great memories, or do you just want to be remembered for finishing third and fourth all the time? It's an argument that always run because it divides camps, like I say, and it always drills into that fact of the Champions League being the be-all and end-all. But where the FA Cup sits in the sort of grand scheme of a season and the club's priorities, Rob, would you advocate perhaps replays being scrapped? Because the competition seems to be a burden. So if we could sort of perhaps lighten the length of the competition, is that something you could see happening? I know we're at the quarter-final stage where they're not going to be a thing anymore, but is that something that perhaps needs to be sort of taken out of the whole structure?
Sadly, yes. And there almost isn't anything better than getting the team from like the Championship or League One taking a Premier League team back to their place, and the whole like mystique of, can they knock them out on a Wednesday night, which they never do. They, I think every replay always ends 3-0 to the bigger team. But yeah, I think they need to go because as much as I like replays, I like that's a different edge to the FA Cup, that if you draw, you have to go and play this extra game rather than just going to extra time penalties. No teams like them. I would think perhaps a better way of doing it is to almost take the German approach, which is that all the smaller clubs have to host whoever they get in the draw.
Yeah,
so
good shout.
Obviously last night Sutton were drawn at home anyway, but if it for the next round, let's say Lincoln would host Arsenal and get the gate receipts that way. So they get that competitive edge of having the home tie, obviously.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually, I was going to sort of allude to, because with replay, especially in the third round where a club could get the likes of a top 6 team, like let's say Exeter, when they drew with Liverpool, was it last season, that replay for them at Anfield has probably set their transfer budget for the next season or two, and that's huge for them. So the FA are going to have to sort of think to themselves, if we do take away replays, then something's got to then fill the gap. So it's either a bigger prize money pool, or, like you just touched on, Rob, something where the draw is then sort of flipped, where the smaller team always plays away. I guess in doing that, you perhaps then lose that fairy tale of going to an Anfield, going to an Old Trafford. But these are decisions that the FA Cup and the FA are going to have to sort of make going forward, because we're watching a great tournament each year become sort of less and less in the sort of psyche of football fans. I don't know about you, but me personally, you almost sort of grown at the FA Cup up until like the quarter final or the semi final. It's like, I think we're so sort of Premier League that this sort of cup competition is almost a bit of an annoyance. It's almost, if you're out of it, never mind. If you get to where we are now as Tottenham and Arsenal fans, you think, well, actually, you're only sort of a game from Wembley, and it almost gets exciting, but it's a bit of a sort of struggle to get there, really, isn't it? So people advocate, for example, with the winners of the FA Cup then enter the Champions League. Now, for me, I think it's an awful idea. I don't know where you two would sit on that. If I asked you, James, first, where would you sit on the idea of...
Yeah, no, I think that's an awful idea too. I mean, with that, I think you'd see people getting into the... Well, I think it would probably be an easier route into the FA Cup, and for me, that top 4 position, it's something that we toiled for years and years and years for. And to see a team kind of wander into that position for a lot less effort. To be a top 4 team, you need more than just to win a couple of games, and we know that as Spurs fans, because we've watched our team grow from a team that's been knocking on the door of the top. I mean, well, if you go back even further, a mid-table team to a Europa League team to knocking on the door of the top 4. So now, hopefully, a sustained part of that top 4, and just to see a team kind of win, I don't know, what is it, 5 or 6 games and catch a place into the Champions League, and then probably just get knocked out straight away. But no, for me, a place in the Champions League is something that you certainly have to earn, and you have to prove that you're worthy of.
Is that something you're in agreement with, Rob? I mean, playing 38 games is surely a worthier entrance to the Champions League than, say, winning 6. Where do you sit on that?
Yeah, I agree. I've never really liked the idea that a team could win the FA Cup and get into the Champions League. I mean, the sad thing is that the death of the FA Cup or the dying of the FA Cup has almost come around the same time that the Cup Winners' Cup was scrapped at the end of the 90s. Because obviously that was the year afterwards that Man United pulled out of the FA Cup, and everyone always cites that as when the competition lost a lot of its lustre. But I mean, the Cup Winners' Cup, as an Arsenal fan, it was great, because obviously we got to the final in 94, got to the final again in 95, and why did I bring that up with 2 Spurs fans? I'm starting to regret this already. But that was a competition that a lot of English clubs did quite well in, actually. Arsenal obviously got to finals. Chelsea, I think, won it one year as well.
That's right.
West Ham won it. So Man United won it, of course, as well. That was one of Fergie's first trophies with them, actually.
Yeah, they beat Barcelona, didn't they?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's sad in a way that, I mean, that competition got absorbed by the UEFA Cup, now obviously the Europa League, and I mean, that's sort of when the FA Cup started to lose a bit of lustre, and I've never really liked the idea that a team could win 6 games, get into the Champions League, and not just because it would ruin the coefficient, as some people bring up. I don't really care about the coefficient, to be honest. It's just there's no, I can't even think what the word is, there's no precedent. There's no precedent for it. It's not like if a Spanish club wins the Copa del Rey, they get into the Champions League. There's nowhere else, no other European league, the cup winners get into the Champions League, so there's no precedent for it for me.
Do you know what, Rob, that's the point I always exactly make to everyone else, that it's never something else in Europe, and I don't see why this harebrained idea always comes up in England. And if any football fans suggest that to me, if I was in a pub when someone said that, I would probably just drink my pint very quickly and sort of back out the door. Because it's not kind of the opinion you can really trust in a football fan, really. But I'm glad we're all in agreement. So, yeah, for me, that's something that I would not want to see. I think that sort of wraps up the FA Cup. I think we've sort of wrapped up the first half quite nicely. As it's the first week, I've got no listeners' questions. So to everyone listening on the podcast now, firstly, thank you. I hope you're enjoying the first 15 or so minutes. And if you've got any listeners' questions, you can either tweet me at Dan Tracey 1983, or you can tweet at _footballnet. With just some general football questions. I guess there needs to be some sort of hashtag. Probably put EPod. Yeah, hashtag EPod. If you've got any football questions, so if they come to me, I know it's to do with this and not just general football questions at sort of 2 a.m. on a Saturday night. But so yeah, please come with us with your questions, because I'd love to sort of read them out with the guests next week. And leading on to that, I do need to do the social media. Otherwise, you won't know where to find us, and it'll be a wasted half an hour. So the important bits are on Twitter and Instagram. So Twitter and Instagram, you can follow us at _footballnet. On Facebook, it's facebook.com/efootballpage, and the website is www.efootballonline.com, and that will give you all the sort of latest podcast updates and all the latest football news. So that's all the social media bits and bobs out the way, but do get your questions in, because that's going to really help us going forward. And now we'll move in to the second half. So we've all had our Lucasade Sport and we're all refreshed and ready to go. So put the cup to bed for at least a couple of weeks. And I want to touch on the Champions League now. We're recording this on a Tuesday night, and unfortunately we don't have the technology to do 3 different versions about Man City's results. So we're going to have to gloss over that one, unfortunately. But we can focus more on Leicester in depth. And it's a big defining week for them, for Ranieri and co, because they've already lost in the Cup once this past 7 days with a defeat to Millwall. And you'd almost sort of think, is it that much of a giant killing in the way they sort of made, 10 changes, perhaps with this game in mind. But they're going up against a Sevilla side that many felt, once Unai Emery moved to PSG in the summer, that it would be the end of an era. They won 3 Europa League titles. Could they sustain that? With the new manager, Jorge Sampaoli, ex-Chile boss, they've almost gone from strength to strength. They're giving themselves a great crack at La Liga. They are thirds, and they're right on Barcelona's tails. They're really sort of pushing to sort of be a top-tier Spanish club, if not already. They've relinquished their own grip on the Europa League by actually going through to the Champions League round of 16. So the question is, Rob, for you first, how do you think Leicester are going to do in this first leg? Is it the fact they put all their eggs into this European basket going to sort of pay off for them, or is that gamble now going to backfire?
I can really see them struggling against Sevilla, who are absolutely brilliant at the minute. I mean, up there challenging Real Madrid for the Spanish title, which outside of the top 3 no one ever does these days. So I really fear for Leicester, unless Sevilla haven't watched them in the last 18 months and think, oh, they don't counter-attack, it's fine, we'll just give this Jamie Vardy all the space in the world. That they are really going to struggle, I reckon. How do you see it panning out, James?
Yeah, no, I have to agree. I mean, Leicester, they've had a good little run in the Champions League. I can't say I've watched Leicester in the Champions League too much, because they were on at the same time as Spurs quite a lot of the time, and so I was busy watching the Spurs games. But from what I've seen in highlights, I mean, they do play how they played in the Premier League last season, with that, as you say, that counter-attacking football, that pace on the break. But as you say, Sevilla really on top at the minute. They're just in a form where a lower league English team aren't going to trouble them. I can't see it. And I mean, Leicester, if they were feeling a bit more confident going into it, then you'd like to think maybe there was a shock on the cards. But having lost to Millwall at the weekend, that confidence is going to be absolutely rock bottom. And therefore, I think we can all see a Sevilla win incoming, unless, Dan, you can think of anything different.
No, for me, I think it's got to be a full house of Sevilla wins from the panel. I just think that Leicester, they needed the win on Saturday just to sort of get back into that mentality of just winning games, because since the start of the year they've not won in the Premier League. They've scored 1 goal, I think, is it, in the Premier League. It's just they're in a rut. A real bad rut. And I think this is the wider question now. Rob, you first. Do you think Leicester are going to get relegated this season? Is this the ultimate crash and burn?
You know, I've been thinking they were going to get relegated since about October. And I mean, yeah, I actually think it could happen. I mean, I also thought West Ham were going to go down at some point this season, but they seem to turn themselves around thanks to Andy Carroll. But yeah, they just look a complete mess. They look a complete shadow of themselves. And I mean, Ranieri's got a job there till the end of the season. I don't believe he deserves to be sacked just because of how great last year was, really, for them. It would almost be too sad to see him get the sack before the end of this season. But they're just a mess. They don't seem like they had one trick, it almost seemed, last year, which was being pretty resolute at the back and great with Vardy on the counter-attack, and everyone sussed that out, and they've never really found a plan B, it seems.
Absolutely. I've got an interesting question for you, James. Do you think that the fact that Claudio Ranieri winning the league last season obviously has given him a job, not for life, but certainly to the end of the season, do you think that's almost a bit of a hindrance for Leicester? Because where other teams have been allowed to roll the dice and sack managers, such as Hull and Swansea, and they're going through a resurgence, do you feel the fact that Leicester's loyalty from their owners could be their ultimate demise, because ultimately they have to stay with Ranieri? Do you see what the point I'm trying to make?
No, of course. I mean, I've never been from the vein of thought that if results aren't going your way, then you sack the manager. I'm not a fan of that at all. But however, in this situation, I think it's fairly clear that I don't want to say that Ranieri's tactically inept, because that's clearly untrue. The man led Leicester to a Premier League title, and therefore he must have that footballing knowledge. However, I think what it comes down to this time is that Leicester last season must have just had the right recipe for success. You know, they had Conte running the midfield. They had a solid back four in Fuchs, Simpson, Morgan and Huth. They had a great goalkeeper in Schmeichel, and they had Jamie Vardy, who just could not stop scoring, and Riyad Mahrez pulling the strings, you know. And I think what I compare it to, again, is Harry Redknapp at Tottenham. Is that when Harry Redknapp was at Tottenham, he had a team that picked itself. He had a midfield that was absolutely top class. And so in the Champions League, we did well. Last year, Ranieri had a Leicester team that picked itself, because he has players who are in such good form. And this year, when they're relying on tactics a little bit more, because teams have got them worked out. They've lost Conte. Vardy might not be firing. Mahrez might not be firing. They might have had a few injuries. They need their manager to be able to shuffle it a bit more. And really, I don't think they've invested well. They haven't, even though they have won the Premier League, they've got a Premier League title under their belt, they haven't got the kind of weight behind them to be able to recruit the kind of players that they wanted to recruit. I mean, they brought in Slimani. That's a gamble that hasn't really paid off. And so I think they haven't really made their squad any deeper. They haven't improved on their squad. And I think losing Conte will probably see them off for the rest of the season. Going back to whether Leicester will be relegated, I genuinely do think they will be relegated this season. And after last season, I would quite like to see it, I'm not going to lie.
A bit of schadenfreude there, James, I imagine. I guess if we touch on Leicester's transfers, Rob, the fact that Ranieri spent 77 million, and a lot of those players haven't really featured in and around the first team as much as you would expect. Do you also think that, where I touched on the loyalty from the owners to Ranieri, do you think Ranieri's loyalty to the players that won the title last season has also been to Leicester's detriment?
Yeah, I mean, out of the three that everybody wanted, they perhaps let the most important one go as well, in Kante, who looks pretty certain to win back-to-back titles with different teams. Yeah, I mean, he dropped Vardy for a spell, which actually paid. Well, no, he didn't drop Vardy for a spell. Vardy got suspended, didn't he? And that seemed to pay off, because I think they won most of those games. But I mean, yeah, they really just look a shadow of themselves. It's almost as if they've just completely dropped off from that high. And, you know, the hardest challenge, Arsenal have never retained the Premier League title under Wenger. And I mean, some of the time perhaps that's because he was too loyal, didn't quite inject enough into his team, and they finished second all those times the year after they'd won it. And for Leicester, perhaps that's what they didn't do. They didn't inject enough in the summer. Yes, they spent the money, but Slimani's barely played. Everyone else they've signed has hardly played this season. I think there's only the lad that they got in to replace Kante, who has been a bit of a pale imitation of him. His name slips my mind for the minute.
Is it Wilfred Ndidi? They bought quite a few, actually, Kante-like replacements.
Yeah.
They've gone through about 2 or 3. Daniel Amartey was one.
Amartey, I think, was the one I was thinking of.
Yeah. Was it now past Mendy? So they've got 3, and none of them have come close. And it almost sort of makes Danny Drinkwater look half the player he is, because Kante was doing twice the work last season. When you look at Danny Drinkwater in, May of June of last year, and everyone was getting him on the plane, getting to the Euros, and now the thought of him in an England shirt is so far removed. It's incredible what one player can do for a team, and it's incredible how a team can collapse on itself within 12 months. So I think, from my point of view, I think Leicester players have almost thought, do you know what, it's never ever going to be as good as it was last season. I just don't think they can mentally pick themselves up again. Perhaps the Champions League might be different tomorrow against a very tough Sevilla side, but in the sort of week-to-week life of the Premier League, I just don't think the spark's there anymore, and I think that's why results are going the way they are, and they're sort of plummeting down the table. But it's going to be a real big couple of weeks for Leicester, because if this mentality continues, this negative spiral, then you do wonder where the point's going to come from, and how actually they're going to sort of claw their way out of the bottom 3, because the way the teams around them are, Palace have obviously rolled the dice and it's not gone their way, but Hull and Swansea, for example, they're on an upward trajectory, and Leicester's are going down. And you look at Leicester and Swansea, that game is the perfect example. The two have now sort of swapped positions, so it's worrying times at the King Power. But that's enough for Leicester. We'll now move on to the Europa League. Spurs fans, you can probably sort of grimace at the fact we lost to Ghent last week. Not a great performance, but we won't sort of gloss on that too much. I'd rather sort of look forward than behind. I'm going to go to you, Rob, first, go for a non-Spurs fan's view, but with Spurs buoyed by their 3-0 win at Fulham on Sunday, do you think that's the sort of perfect setup for progression in the Europa League, or will there be another Wembley hoodoo on Thursday?
I would be very surprised if he went out again on Thursday, as much as I'd like to watch it. I don't know, surely you're going to win a game at Wembley, because aren't you playing a whole season there next season?
Yeah, well, we've got to sort of learn to love it, really. We beat CSKA Moscow in the last of the Champions League group stages. It was almost like a Europa League playoff, I guess, but yeah, I mean, it's going to be good practice for next season, because it's going to be quite essential that we do sort of learn to make use of Wembley. But last Thursday, the way we played, tactics weren't quite right. It looked a very disjointed team, but thankfully the way we played on Sunday, we looked back in that groove that we've certainly not had in the last sort of 2-3 weeks. So again, it was only Fulham, but again, it's only Ghent, so the levels the same, and you'd like to think that result can sort of give them the momentum to go on and beat Ghent and overturn that deficit. James, your views?
I mean, I think you'd like to think that we wouldn't need a result like Fulham at the weekend for our lads to turn around, look at each other in the dressing room and think, boys, we've got 80,000 fans or near on sat outside. Do we really want to go out of Europe in this way? I mean, it might not be the way that footballers think nowadays, but I'd like to think that they, these guys actually want to win as much as we want them to. And I honestly can't see us going out to Ghent this week. But you never know with our Tottenham, do you? No,
you don't. But me personally, I'm confident. Like I say, I think Fulham was the shot in the arm that we needed as a club, and it should hopefully sort of set us back into that momentum, especially at this time of the season, because I think that week could have really defined the season. It could have almost sort of collapsed, really. Defeat to Liverpool, defeat in the Europa League, knocked out potentially the FA Cup if we were lost to Fulham, and it could have been a very sort of, what was a positive into a sort of huge negative. But I think we've sort of come out of that tailspin, and hopefully Thursday will set us back in the right direction. If we move on to Manchester United, they won 3-0 last week. That will probably afford them the chance to rest players, because Jose Mourinho was sort of saying that fixture congestion is going to be a bit of an issue coming forward with all these potential competitions coming up, with all the sort of progress they're making in the Cups. And that sort of brings me nicely to the EFL Cup final. We can all assume that they're going to get through the Europa League after beating Saint Etienne so comfortably, so we'll gloss over that. But in terms of the EFL Cup final, it's Manchester United versus Southampton. Southampton have already knocked out Arsenal and Liverpool en route to Wembley, so they're going to sort of go in certainly with some confidence. Is this a done deal, or is there a slight upset on the cards, Rob?
I hope there's a slight upset on the cards, because anything to stop Mourinho winning trophies. or Manchester United in general winning trophies, to be fair. I don't know, Southampton have sort of been a bit hit and miss this season. They've been great in the League Cup, mind, but I mean, everywhere else they've been a bit patchy in the league. They've not really been as close to the top 6 as they usually are. The FA Cup, they got absolutely destroyed by Arsenal, although they did play quite a weak team, because it was only a couple of days after the Liverpool game. I don't know. Mourinho does really like the League Cup. It does seem to be the first trophy he wins wherever he seems to appear, in England at least. So him winning it for the fourth time, wouldn't shock me in the slightest. But come on, Southampton, because I'm also sick of hearing about how Man United were unbeaten for about 2 years when they lost to Hull only a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, everyone seems to sort of gloss over that blip, don't they? It's all about this unbeaten record, but they sort of edge past Hull over 2 legs. With no Virgil van Dijk, I know he didn't play against Liverpool and they still managed to get through that task. Is that going to be an issue for Southampton going into the final, James?
Certainly, yeah. I mean, aside from obviously Toby Alderweireld and Jan Vertonghen, I really, really do like Virgil van Dijk as one of the best centre-halves in the Premier League. Going back to how I think it'll go, I mean, I think Man United have got players who are big game players. You can't not mention your Zlatans and your Pogbas. But I mean, players like Anthony Martial and even Jesse Lingard have turned up in these big games that maybe a Liverpool and an Arsenal don't have, you know. And so that's how Southampton have got their way to the final. Southampton they'll have to stick to their game plan. They'll have to stick to their guns. They'll have to call upon all of their like creative players. You know, you Dusan Tadic, you Nathan Redmond, and you'd like to think it would be a fairly even game. And the League Cup final is usually a fairly even tie. You know, you've got Southampton who are playing up, Man United possibly playing down. But, you know, I think with the quality that United have got in their side, with Pogba and Ibrahimovic pulling it out the bag, you'd like to be able to say that they're going to claim the first silverware of the season. OK, with that in mind, if we go for some predictions for the scoreline on Sunday, Rob, what do you reckon?
2-1 Man United, sadly.
And you, James?
2-0 Man United.
I'm going to go for... Do you know what? I'm going to go 3-0 Man United. I think it will be quite comfortable. I think with the form that Zlatan Ibrahimovic is in at the moment, and you know the way he's got 4 goals in the last week, people had their doubts at the start of the season, and he's just starting to come better each week, and he's really showing the kind of form that has lit up leagues across Europe. I'm not saying he's necessarily going to get a hat-trick, but I think he'll have a sort of defining role in the game. I don't think it's going to be a good day for Southampton. So sorry, Southampton fans. Please don't feel you're not going to sort of follow the show going forward. But I just think it's going to be a relatively comfortable win for the Red Devils. But then again, what do we know? Do you know what I mean? We'll have to wait till Sunday. I think that'll probably wrap it up for this week. There's obviously a lot of Premier League football at the weekend, but we can't really preview everything. So what we'll do, we'll review that next week. Otherwise, we'll have nothing to talk about next week. So I think that'll make a lot of sense. So first, thanks for listening, people out there. I really hope you've enjoyed it. I've had a great time hosting it. I hope that I've done a good enough job to be in charge next week. I have to thank Rob Tonkinson for joining me. Thanks, Rob.
No worries. Thanks, everyone as well.
And I have to thank not Everton and Republic of Ireland International James McCarthy.
Thank you very much for having me again, Dan.
So with that in mind, it's time for me to say goodbye, and I hope you join me next week. Until then, goodbye.